Namo Buddhaya and a very warm welcome, dear Dharma friends, to our Friday Dharma sharing session under our Dharma Dana lecture series. I'm Brother Eric and I will be your host for today. We are privileged to have with us Ayasma Arya Dhammika as our speaker for today. Let us now bring Bante online. Sukihotu Bante, and welcome to our Facebook live page, Bante. Okay. We will do a short introduction on Ayasma Arya Dhammika. Venerable Ayasma Arya Dhammika is an Austrian Buddhist monk who ordained in 2005 in Myanmar with Pa Auk Sayadaw as his preceptors and meditation teacher. He maintained a very simple lifestyle, living out in the open and under trees, dedicating himself to mindfulness of breathing and later also to many other meditation subjects. He was initiated into meditation technique of Mogok Mahasi, Sui Omin under Yu Tejaniya and Sun Lun. He went to Thailand in 2010 where he stayed for 3 years at Wat Pa Nanachat, undergoing the traditional training of a Thai forest monk of Ajahn Chah lineage. He stayed in Malaysia from 2013 to 2015, studying Pali, Sutanta, and the Vinaya under the guidance of Venerable Ayasma Agachita. From 2015 to 2018, he stayed in Sri Lanka and returned to Malaysia in January 2018, where he was appointed Sangha Nayaka of SBS Monk Training Center. Today's topic is very much thought-provoking and is entitled, What is Early Buddhism? With that, we welcome Venerable Ayasma Arya Dhammika to deliver today's Dhamma sermon. Bante.
Okay, thank you, Eric, for the kind introduction. I'm glad to be here this evening, and also greetings everyone from Taipei SBS Monk Training Center. Actually, just yesterday, at the same time, this time around, there was a heavy downpour of rain. When that happens, you can barely hear your own words, and there would have been no way that we can conduct our Dhamma session with that weather. It would be so noisy that you would not be able to understand anything. But today, we're quite lucky, huh? It's not raining tonight. But maybe you still won't be able to understand much. Not so much because of the rain, but because of my Austrian accent. Anyway, I'm trying to adapt already, but not easy. Little bit speak Malaysian English can, but passe. Anyway, today I would like to speak a bit about early Buddhism. And I wanted to ask you first, what do you think is the meaning of early Buddhism? What do you understand when you hear this term? Maybe I give you a few seconds or a minute. Key in Facebook in the comment section. I'm curious to see what you think early Buddhism could mean. Is it about Theravada or Mahayana or about suttas? Or, don't know. Key in a few words what you think is early Buddhism, what that stands for. You can leave it in the comment section. I'm sure some of you will have heard this term before, early Buddhism. But what are they meaning when they say this? Okay, let me see the comments. Have a brief look, the comment section. All right. So you had your chance to express what you think is early Buddhism, and now I will try my luck. In today's talk, first off, I would like to highlight a bit the importance of a non-dogmatic approach to Dhamma studies and practice. And the emphasis is really on non-dogmatic. What does that mean? It means that we look for evidence and we want to understand, despite of our maybe preconceived ideas or views or things that we have accepted from somewhere or somebody. And this non-dogmatic approach is very important for learning anything, not just the Dhamma. Being open to new ideas, being open to check whether our old ideas are the correct or not. And often they are, sometimes maybe not, or maybe only partly. So being open allows us to welcome new teachings or new insights, new knowledge. In the synopsis of this talk, it was already said that emphasis will be given on the method of putting early Buddhist texts side by side and looking for commonalities among them, and in this way identifying teachings of high authenticity. Then later, I would also like to highlight a few popular misconceptions about aspects of the Dhamma which maybe many of us wrongly believe in. And these fake teachings, we have fake news, we have also fake Dhamma. These fake teachings are usually the result of historically later developments, not the original teachings of the Buddha. So in the next 45 minutes, we will do a bit of detective work, a bit like Sherlock Holmes, with a pipe. You can sit down with a pipe, with a magnifying glass, and do a bit of detective work about the Dhamma now. Also, I would like to invite, if you have any questions, please feel free to key them in on Facebook, and we can then discuss them at the end of the session. Let me give you a little bit of my own first contact with Buddhism. My own first contact was actually not with Theravada Buddhism. I was first attracted or got in contact with Tibetan Buddhism. And I was particularly inspired and drawn in by the charisma and kind of nice attitude of the Dalai Lama in particular. So it's kind of quite a likable person, I find. But then later, after a while, I discovered, in Tibetan Buddhism, there's also a lot of rituals, like prayers, music, and very little emphasis on meditation, which I was really most interested in. So I found it strange, They had Buddhism was supposed to be everything about meditation, but mostly what I heard and what I saw the monks also doing was spending a lot of time for prayers, for chants. And then I kept searching, kept my ears open. And then I found out about Theravada Buddhism, which seemed much more authentic in this sense. But I thought this will really be now what I can imagine the Buddha would be teaching. I could not imagine that the Buddha was very much drawn into rituals and belief systems. I would much more imagine that the Buddha was more interested in meditation, teaching the Dhamma in a very straightforward way, nothing mystical. So that's what brought me to Theravada, the simplicity and also the earliness of the teachings. And I was very drawn in by that. Always going back to the source. So then I eventually became a monk in Myanmar, in Burma, in Baok. I practiced according to the methods taught there and had good experiences. So that fitted quite well for me, I have to say. And as many of you know, in Myanmar also there is not only the Vinaya, but also the Dhamma and also the Abhidhamma very strongly emphasized. And then after some time, somebody told me, you know, this Abhidhamma, some people say, yeah, this Abhidhamma, this came a bit later. It's not so sure that this is really the earliest teaching of the Buddha, he said to me. I looked at him, what are you talking about? I came to Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism stands for early Buddhism, isn't it? Now you're telling me this is also not early, what we are doing here? So I was not happy with this monk who told me. Anyway, I kept practicing, but I still kept my ears open. Also, some people recommended to read the suttas. And more, I also started to see some passages where there seemed to be discrepancy between the Abhidhamma teachings and the suttas that I was reading. And then, in this way, I became a little bit aware of this discussion going on. And also the suttas themselves, they are nowadays also interpreted by the commentaries and explained by the commentaries, the true meaning, supposedly. So again, but the commentaries also are a bit later development often. They're early commentaries, they're later commentaries, they're sub-commentaries, they're sub-commentaries. So then eventually I came to understand, well, maybe that's also not the earliest one, but at least the suttas, the suttas I can rely on. Then I felt happy. Okay, I got my early teachings. You know what happened then? Somebody else came along and he said, even the suttas also have undergone some evolution. And even there we should not believe it's exactly the word of the Buddha, should compare with other early teachings from other schools. Really? Now even the suttas I cannot rely anymore. But what I'm telling you is, I was always interested in coming closer and closer to the original Buddha's teachings. There are so many teachings in circulation, and I'm sure many of you have noticed that, especially here in Malaysia. You encounter monks coming from Thailand, from Burma, from Sri Lanka, from overseas, from the West. And many of them are in line, but also many of them contradict each other a little bit. But my own core interest, was never so much what does Guru X or Sayadaw Y or Ajahn Z, Swami Vahansa, Lama or Rinpoche, so-and-so, what are they teaching? That was never my core interest. My interest was always, what did the Buddha teach? What did the Buddha really teach? Because to me, and I think to many of us, if not all of us here, the Buddha, as we know, is the first refuge. It's a refuge. And not just the Buddha alone, there's also the teaching, his teaching, the Dhamma, that he formulated and shared with us. That's the second refuge. So for me, I almost see it as my duty to try to investigate and play Sherlock Holmes, trying to find out what was the Buddha really teaching. Because we cannot deny we're living 2,500 years after the Buddha, so surely it is to be expected that there will be a little bit of evolution, development of the Dhamma. Certain things may be forgotten, and often unintentionally texts having been corrupted. But always my interest, what did the Buddha teach? So as I said earlier, so many different teachers coming from here, from there, and some of them having a really great reputation as masters, meditation masters. And they have a lot of disciples. Then always the question, whom to trust? There's so many. Then I came across one discourse, one sutta. It's called the Mahapadisa Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya 4.180. And there the Buddha explains, when you hear somebody teach something that sounds like the Dhamma or the Vinaya, remember it. And then compare it with the suttas and the Vinaya. If it's included and found within the suttas or the Vinaya, then you should hold it. Yes, this is the Buddha's teachings. But if it's not included in the suttas and the Vinaya, then you should put it aside. You should discard it and conclude, no, this is not the Buddha's teachings. So it's a very simple principle and very applicable, especially in our current time and age, where we have so many different teachings floating around. So the Buddha recommended to find out what is really the Dhamma. Take the Dhamma that is already established in the suttas, in the Vinaya, and compare whatever we hear, regardless of whether it comes from a renowned teacher with many followers, or just from a small samanera. Whoever says it doesn't really matter. We just compare it with the Buddha's own teachings, the suttas and the Vinaya. And that turned out for me to be very practical advice and guideline. But by doing that, I also noticed sometimes something that I thought is the Buddha's teachings, or that I thought, yeah, this is really said by the Buddha. Sometimes I later find out, no, actually it was not. So then also again, we need the willingness to change our opinions, to take in new information and adapt and adjust our perspective accordingly if new evidence comes along. Like this is what I earlier meant with a non-dogmatic approach to Dhamma studies and practice. A little bit, often it's recommended a meditator should be like an empty cup. Like a cup here, let me check first. Yeah, it's an empty cup. So that's how a meditator should be. Because if you have an empty cup, you can put water or whatever liquid you want inside, and it will contain that valuable liquid substance, and it will hold it. But if a cup is full already, brim full, like a person full with ideas and views about the Dhamma, about the practice, everything, you know everything already, then whatever water you pour in, it will just overflow. Or like a cup upside down. Also, you can try as much as you want. People might give you, people might come, they will try to pour the true Dhamma, the pure Dhamma inside, but the cup is upside down, cannot hold anything, still empty. So in this way, we should be like an empty cup and then absorb whatever seems reasonable and right. In fact, there's a very famous sutta about this. It's called the Kalama Sutta. Can we see a slide about the Kalama Sutta? The Kalama Sutta says, Kalamas, do not go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability, or by the thought, this contemplative is our teacher. This contemplative is our guru. So by these things we should not go. But when Kalama, you know for yourselves, these things are unwholesome. These things are blameworthy. These things are censured by the wise. These things if accepted and undertaken, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon them. So that was the Buddha's advice to the Kalamas. So it's a very practical guideline. And the important part is here that even scriptures are also not holy, Even scriptures cannot always trust. So sure, scriptures often contain very ancient knowledge and often can help us. But even scriptures, we need to double check them, especially nowadays where the scriptures are so old and have been passed down for so many years. But also don't go just by logic or by what you like, because that's also not a reliable guide. But if you practice something and you see your wholesome qualities increase, the unwholesome ones decrease, that's something reliable to be guided by. However, the Pali Suttas are a very good starting point, I would say. Even though it has been pointed out by several scholars that they do have undergone some evolution and development, until they were finalized at the Third Council at about 300 BC, meaning 300 years before the Common Era. This means 200 years between the Buddha's Parinibbana and the closing of the canon. 200 years have passed. And only after that time, the canon, in the Pali canon, in the Theravada tradition, was considered closed, and no new things could be added or removed. But the first 200 years, that was not yet the case. But the Pali canon is, of course, the best that we have, right? Well, it is partially right. The Pali discourses are the earliest complete recording of the Buddha's words. The emphasis is on complete. But there are also records of selected discourses or entire chapters or books originating from other schools of selected discourses and of other schools than the Theravada school. And many of these chapters and books were originally passed down in Sanskrit or Prakrit. And then eventually they were translated also into Chinese language. And the Chinese version is referred to as the Agamas. And the Agamas are considered as on equal footing with the Pali Suttas. Even though they belong to different schools, they still belong to the very earliest strata of text. So even though nowadays we have schools which we would call Mahayana schools, and they have their own Mahayana sutras, but they also have in their Tipitaka these Agamas. It's probably true they don't study these Agamas a lot, because this is kind of the Hinayana material, but they also have that in their own corpus of texts. Whereas what they really study is then the later sutras that were developed, like the Lotus Sutra, Diamond Sutra, Heart Sutra. But these are by far not early sutras. No of the early Buddhist texts speak of a Lotus Sutra, Heart Sutra. They are not found. But the Agamas, these are the parallels, these are the equivalent to the Pali Suttas, to the discourses. Even though the Agamas belong to different schools. You already hear me say schools. What does that refer to? Different schools. Now we only have Theravada, Mahayana, is it? Then why do we speak about early Buddhism? What do we even mean with early? Actually, Wikipedia explains that early Buddhism can often refer to pre-sectarian Buddhism, which refers to the teachings and monastic organization and structure founded by Gautama Buddha. And Lambertus Schmidhausen explains that the canonical period prior to the development of different schools with their different positions. That's what is meant with pre-sectarian Buddhism. So before the schools were going into different directions. So this is called pre-sectarian Buddhism or early Buddhism. I have prepared a slide from Wikipedia. I would like to look at that together with you. Let's have a look. Okay, so while Eric is trying to bring on the slide full screen, I will start to explain a little bit. So you can see here the different strata and developments in Buddhist history. And it starts out on top here with the early Sangha in India. So this is 450 before Christ, 450 before the Common Era, or even 500. This is the early Sangha. But then also from 250 before until, we would say, even something latest until 500, we still have quite a number of early Buddhist schools. Not just one or two, altogether 18. There were 18 Buddhist schools. And the Theravada that you see here is just one of them. But you can see it also continue here. And that's the only one that survived. But there were 17 others. But their texts have not survived, their tradition, they couldn't manage to have a continuous lineage of monks and nuns. So these schools died out. But some scriptures we still have from them. So these are the early Buddhist schools. And then we have here, down here, also in Asia, the same development of early Buddhist schools, which then also some of which developed into Mahayana doctrines. But at the beginning, there was no Mahayana. And then you can see here all the different schools and the different names. So quite a bit of development going on here, you can see. And the question is also, what are these early Buddhist schools? Well, let me show you the next slide. You can also see from Wikipedia, these are only the early 18 schools. Sthaviravada. This is what then is now called the Theravada. The speech or doctrine of the elders. And then Mahishasaka, Samastivada, Kashyapya. Many names you've probably never heard. Some of them I don't even know how to pronounce. So you can read it in your own free time if you like. But just to give you a bit of an overview. So these were 18 schools existing in the first, maybe not the first 100, but after 200 years, after Buddha's passing away, we already have a lot of development. Then going on for another 500, 600, 700 years. And the Theravada continued all the while, all the time until today. So fragments and scriptures of these other schools are actually still found and are still available, but not complete Tipitakas of these schools. So complete version we find only in the Pali version. So which of these schools and the texts of which schools are more reliable, which are less? Well, these early schools, we cannot say more or less reliable, because they all build on the same corpus of texts. And they made great efforts to maintain these texts. There's a small controversy. I think we don't need this slide anymore. Thank you. There's a small controversy. Some scholars speculate that maybe the Samyutta Nikaya or Samyukta Agama could be the earliest form or the earliest book. Why? Because in these texts, there's mentioning of the Angas, which is a classification system that was used very early, where you can classify texts in prose and verse, or Q&A sessions, inspired utterances, and so on. But these were originally meant as textual styles, not as books. But some scholars also have misunderstood that or take that to mean that this refers to books. And since the Samyutta Nikaya and the Samyukta Agama is the only one that refers to this early classification system, they speculate that therefore this must be the earliest book of the Sutta Pitaka. But that has been shown by other scholars to be not a very reliable conclusion to draw. In fact, these early books, Digha, Majjhima, Anguttara Nikaya, and their parallels in the Agamas, they all, we cannot distinguish and say, well, this is earlier, this is later. So how were these texts, these early texts, how were they transmitted? Wouldn't that be good to know? Because if you put on all your faith and you want to do your practice, your meditation, you want to base that on the Buddha's teachings, wouldn't it be interesting to know how are we getting these Buddha's teachings? From where did we get them? How were they transmitted? Because obviously there was no YouTube around at the time, I assume. No MP3 recorders. So how did they transmit these texts? And how did you happen to hear the text at that time? Well, the only way you could hear the Dhamma is from somebody else who tells you by all means. And the only way to know it and to carry it was by memorizing. So to recite the Dhamma and to memorize, that was the way to maintain it and to pass it on from one generation to another. But this, some people say when they hear, oh, this was just passed on like this from one person to another, that sounds very unreliable. How can you trust that? You know, this is like telling a story and then you tell it to the next person and the person tells it to the third person. And the story that comes back is often very different from the original story. I think there's even a children's game they call the telephone game, isn't it? Where you whisper into the ear of your neighbor, my Aunt Mary has a baby. And then he or she tells to his neighbor, her neighbor, and then eventually it comes back. And then what you hear comes back is, my dog Derry has rabies. Very different, huh? My Aunt Mary has a baby, or my dog Derry has rabies. But this is not how the suttas were transmitted. We are lucky. The transmission of the suttas was actually much more sophisticated. They were not just retelling the content of the Buddha's words. No, they were memorizing it word by word, line by line, and reciting it together in groups, so that even if one person makes a mistake somewhere, it will be auto-corrected, almost like on WhatsApp. You have auto-correct function, right? Or on Facebook, auto-correct. You type something, and then it says no, it corrects you. Sometimes the auto-correct is actually wrong, and something funny can come out. And the same happens with the suttas. When the texts, not just the suttas, also Abhidhamma, commentaries, whatever was recited, but if you do it in a group, then if one person makes a mistake, then it gets corrected by the others, because very unlikely that everyone makes the same mistake at the same place. And it's good. So in this way, the quality maintains and is controlled. So it's not like the telephone game. So monks dedicated many hours of their day to memorizing and maintaining the Dhamma and teaching it to others. And it was written down the first time only about 100 before the Common Era in Sri Lanka, after the Fourth Council. That was the first time. But the first 400 years, it was transmitted orally. But then, what does that mean then for the early schools and for comparative study? Well, since these texts were transmitted orally, also they were kept in different languages and dialects. So these different schools maintained their transmissions in different Indic languages, such as Sanskrit, Uyghur, Gandhari. And they can be found in Northern Asian languages, also like Chinese or Tibetan. But then once a parallel has been located, nowadays, when you find a parallel, you can do a side-by-side comparison. So nowadays, all these texts that were scattered all over the Indian continent and beyond, finally, they come together. Scholars are collecting them and put them side by side and can see the similarities and the differences. And often the difference is actually quite minor. It's often maybe in the sequence of lists. What is number 3 here is number 2 in the other version. What is number 2 is number 4 somewhere else. But the content is surprisingly consistent. Venerable Anarya, who is a foremost scholar in early Buddhism and comparative studies, he writes in a book in the introduction to his comparative study of the Majjhima Nikaya. On page 17, he explains, due to the vicissitudes of human memory and inevitability of error, like from time to time, one makes an error. However well a text is transmitted, mistakes will begin to creep into the collection. But with the aid of comparative study, such mistakes can be rectified. Because now we can put them side by side, and it's very unlikely that different editions made the same error at the same place. So if you have 4 versions, but one is different, you know with high probability that that version might have undergone some textual corruption during the time of oral transmission. And this is pretty much, now we have arrived at this point, this is pretty much how comparative study works. It is based on this principle of finding commonalities among these different versions of similar texts. And the principle is, things that are found in all of them are probably dating back all the way to the Buddha. But things that are maybe found only in one version, but all others have a different passage here, then that could point to some degree of textual corruption with that one version. But things that they all have in common have a high probability of authenticity. However, it does not mean just because some suttas maybe don't have a parallel or we have not found one, that therefore this text is late. That would be a bit premature conclusion to reach. Why? As I said earlier, the Pali Suttas, they come from one source. The Pali Canon is a complete canon. But that's the only one of the early schools that has survived. Whereas the Chinese Agamas, they also have a Dirgha Agama. Dirgha Agama is the equivalent to the Digha Nikaya. They also have a Madhyama Agama, equivalent to the Majjhima Nikaya. They have a Samyukta Agama. What could that be? And they have an Ekottarika Agama, Anguttara. But they come from different schools. So they don't have it just all from the same school. The Dirgha Agama comes from the Dhammaguptaka school. It's a different, one of the 18 schools. Whereas the Madhyama Agama comes most likely from the Sarvastivada school. Whereas the Samyukta Agama comes from the Mula Sarvastivada. It's a different one. To a high probability, maybe 80%. The Ekottarika Agama is a bit uncertain. Even scholars are debating, not 100% clear, but it's commonly nowadays attributed to the Mahasangika. So here we have it. 4 different books, but they all come from different schools that have then been translated and brought into Chinese translation and brought to China. But they're not from one school. So if you're looking for a parallel of a Pali Sutta, say the sutta you like very much, or you find interesting, or something strange, and you want to find a parallel, often you find the parallel, and then you have them side by side, and you can see, oh, it's exactly the same, or there's a small difference here or there. But sometimes we don't know, we don't have a parallel. But that does not mean that therefore this sutta must be late. Why? Why would this be a premature conclusion? Remember, the Chinese agamas, they have their Sutta Pitaka from different schools. And different schools put into their Majjhima Nikaya and Samyutta Nikaya different suttas. So what one school might have put into their Samyutta Nikaya, another one will put into their Anguttara. And if it's a longer sutta, what that school puts in their Anguttara, the next one maybe has it already in their Majjhima Nikaya. So, in the end, what can happen is that since the Chinese has suttas and books from different schools, it can be that certain suttas come 2 times, because what one school put in that book, the other one put in the other book, but the Chinese has it from now these 2 different schools, not the same sutta comes twice. But what can also happen is that you don't have it at all, because we have the Madhyama version from the Sarvastivada, the Majjhima Nikaya version from the Sarvastivada school, but a certain sutta maybe they have put into the Anguttara Nikaya version. But the Anguttara version in the Chinese agamas come from the Mahasangika school. They might have put that same sutta into their Samyukta agama. So we don't have it in the Chinese version, even though it could have been there. Just a matter of transmission and having lost these books. So we cannot make a strong argument from absence. Even in philosophy, an argument of absence is a very weak argument. But if you find parallels and then you see differences, then that can be interesting. So what are the takeaways and conclusions that one can draw from these comparative studies? Because that's what we want to know. I know most of you are not scholars. I'm also not a scholar, actually. I'm mostly interested in meditation and in practice. I got into this whole interest only because I wanted to know how to practice, what to practice. So a kind of interest and curiosity was aroused in these studies, but not for their own sake. But then what are the takeaways and conclusions from those comparative studies? In fact, if you put all these suttas and agamas side by side, they are very consistent, almost no difference. The Vinaya, same, very consistent. Often the origin stories behind a rule is not exactly the same in different schools, but the rules themselves are consistent, the Patimokkha, and so on. But interestingly, the Abhidhammas from different schools, they are completely all over the place. It's almost like they have never seen each other. They are very different from each other. So that's interesting, isn't it? The suttas and Vinaya are so similar, whereas the Abhidhammas from different schools are so different. Venerable Analayo has noticed that also, and I will show you in the next slide what is his takeaway from that. He says that suffice it to say that these divergent schools were not dissimilar in their Vinayas nor in their collection of discourses, but instead how they differentiated and identified themselves were through their Abhidhammas. And there's an interesting aspect here. It's differentiating and also identifying. Because if you're a group or a school of Buddhism, in order to have an identity as a separate group, you should have something different from all others. If everybody says the same, well, how are you a different group? So quite natural that these 18 schools will differentiate themselves mainly through the Abhidhammas. And this is where the debates would happen, where all the scholarship would be invested, because this is where people would see the differences and where you might identify with and get interested. Okay. So it's through the Abhidhammas, not through the Suttas, not through the Vinayas. It's the Abhidhammas where the most and main difference lies. In the Kinti Sutta in Majjhima Nikaya 103, monks are disputing about the Dhamma. Instead of talking about it, they're disputing about it. And here the word Abhidhamma is used, even in the Sutta. What does it refer to? Abhidhamma here refers to the 37 Bodhibhakya Dhammas, to the factors of awakening, like Noble Eightfold Path, Four Noble Truths, 5 powers, 5 faculties, and so on. And the Pali commentaries also say the same. The word Abhidhamma, when it's used in the suttas, does not refer actually to the Abhidhamma Pitaka, but to these teachings about the Dhamma. Abhi can also mean about. So the commentary here says, refers to the 37 Bodhibhakya Dhammas, to the factors of awakening. So it's also worth noting that the early scriptures, almost all occurrences of the term Abhidhamma, is always coming along, or often, with Abhi Vinaya. Have you heard this term before? Abhi Vinaya? Yeah, it's not uncommon. But if somebody says Abhidhamma refers to the Abhidhamma Pitaka, to the books of the Abhidhamma, where's then our Abhi Vinaya Pitaka? We only have one Vinaya Pitaka, the Vinaya Pitaka. We don't have an Abhi Vinaya Pitaka. So again, it is about the Vinaya. Or if you want to use the word Abhi as higher, you can say the higher Vinaya, the higher discipline, like the Bhikkhu Patimokkha for the monks. But it's not a separate corpus of texts. So this is already something what we would say, which we can say from comparative study, that since the differences are so huge and almost no commonalities among these schools, it means most likely, and scholars agree actually, it's not even a controversy, that the Abhidhamma developed much later, developed when the schools had already separated. And only then the different Abhidhammas developed. That's why there's no common core of the Abhidhamma. Whereas they still have the common core of the Suttas and the Vinaya, because that's how it started. Yeah, okay. What's the role of the commentaries? Actually, the commentaries' role is to explain, to commentate on things that we find in the other main material. And also to give a background setting of a certain sutta, for example. One example would be the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata. And the Pali tradition, we find there a lot of verses, like in the Dhammapada is also only verses. So the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata also consists of verse style, whereas the narratives, the stories around these verses are preserved in the commentary, in the Pali commentaries. However, the Chinese version, we see that these two were conflated and they are both together. So in the Chinese equivalent, we see a conflation of these two separate texts whereby the prose coincides with the verses. They come together. And the same cross-contamination or cross-fertilization, if you will, occurs also in the Udana. It's a different book, the Pali Pitaka, Sutta Pitaka, where the opposite is the case. This time the Pali version has the verses mixed with the prose, while the Sanskrit version maintains only the verses. Again, from this comparing Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese versions, we can learn about these differences. Okay, so this was now the framework about how this field works and what is the background of it. But I know nobody, or most of you, will probably not become now Pali scholars, because if you want to do comparative study, you have to know Pali, yes, but also ideally Chinese very well, classical Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Prakrit. Many other Indian fragments are found in different languages. It's not easy. But nowadays we can rely on translations often. So it's getting easier and easier. But then you may ask, and that's what I asked, okay, what are the important takeaways? Give me a case of important finding that we learn from early Buddhist studies. Let me give you one. Have you heard about the decline of the sasana? And as a perspective, and it's actually quite commonly known and prevalent, that the sasana will disappear, the Buddha's dispensation, after a certain period of time. And it's said to be 5,000 years. So the commentaries on the Vinaya Pitaka and also the Anguttara Nikaya, the commentaries there, said that there will be 1,000 years for arahants who attain analytical insight or even psychic powers. So for the first 1,000 years of the Buddha's dispensations. That's already over, you know. Now we are already 2,500 years after. So only for the first 1,000 years, arahants, there can be arahants who have analytical insight. Then follow 1,000 years for arahants without those attainments, like psychic powers, remembering past lives, but they can still be liberated. It's the second 1,000 years. That's also over now. Now, the next 1,000 years, they are for non-returners only. So you can become at most a non-returner. And then 1,000 years for once returners. And then 1,000 years for stream winners only. So then after these 5,000 years, the true doctrine, the true Dhamma, disappears gradually. At first only the texts will be remembered, but nobody will practice anymore. But the text will still be around, the pariyatti, the learning. And then after that, even the texts disappear, and only some signs, some traditions, some rituals will remain. Maybe some people will still remember, oh, it's important to practice generosity. But that alone will not lead to liberation. So this is how, according to the Pali commentaries, the Dhamma will disappear in stages. So if we look back now, we are already more than 2,000 years after. This means, however much you practice, you can't become an arahant anymore. At most, you might become an anagami, if you're lucky. Now, comparative study, both looking at the Pali Suttas, this is not found. Nowhere is it at this 5,000 years. It's not found anywhere in the early Buddhist texts. It comes only in commentaries, sub-commentaries. There are even different versions of what I've just explained to you. Even they don't agree upon each other. So none of this gradual disappearing with these stages is outlined in that detail. Yes, that the Dhamma will disappear gradually, that is also explained by the Buddha, but not with these years. So why is this important? Well, this belief has been, this understanding, many people have followed that. And until recently, including nowadays still, many monks, particularly in Sri Lanka, have this view that nowadays you don't have to practice. These times are over where you can become an Arahant. What you do nowadays is make married and go to heaven. And maybe if you're lucky, you find some Aryas from before, from the earlier days. Maybe some Sotapannas or Sakadagamis who have been reborn in the Devaloka. And then you can hear the Dhamma from them and then start practicing there and maybe attain awakening. So because of this view, because of this perspective, what will happen? No point in practicing. No point in making effort, going into seclusion. No point in meditation. Just make married, go to heaven. So this is a very consequential view and belief that prevents and blocks people from practicing. And generations of monks, not just lay people, also even monks, have fallen for that and have given up on their practice. And even nowadays, I have met monks, not long ago, a year ago, I've spoken with a monk who holds exactly this view. Nowadays, you can't attain. Some even say you can't attain anything. And some say you can't attain awakening, but you can maybe get to the lower Arya stages. But that's nonsense. It's not true. And there's none of the early texts verify that. That's important. Because if somebody believes that, that will prevent that person from practicing and getting the fruits that he might have been able to get and obtain. I'll give you a last one, an example along similar lines. So some Mahayana schools of Buddhism hold that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, they manifest in the world in order to liberate others. And then they return to their pure abodes and to their pure land. So the question can arise whether a Bodhisattva is awakened already or not. Because if he only manifests here to teach, and then he goes back to the Pure Land, then he's kind of like a Buddha. So he just shows up, helps us, and then he goes back. However, in the early texts, the word Bodhisattva is never used in reference to a Buddha or somebody who is awakened already. In fact, the only way how this is referred to in the early texts is this. Let's look at the next slide. In the suttas, the stock phrases, every time when the Buddha speaks about the Bodhisattva, about himself, he says, before my awakening, while I was still an unenlightened Bodhisattva. Unenlightened. It's not somebody who is a Buddha who comes back to teach. He's unenlightened. He doesn't know the Dhamma himself, most likely. So a Bodhisattva is not somebody who is already far advanced. And even the Buddha himself refers to himself as Bodhisattva only in his last birth, only in his last life, in the life in which he became a Buddha. There's no early text where the Buddha refers to himself as a Bodhisattva from previous life, like from 100 years ago, 1 eon ago. No. It's only in the last life, when he enters the mother's womb. At that time, he says, the Bodhisattva enters the mother's womb, mindfully and fully aware, and has his birth then later. So it's always an unenlightened being. And we see that the Buddha often, whenever he speaks about himself, having been a Bodhisattva, you can see that he was grappling with unwholesome states, such as fear, that when he was living alone in the forest, or sometimes he was lured in and attracted by sensual objects, by sense desires, because his mind didn't get settled in renunciation. That was before his awakening, when he was still only a Bodhisattva. And he also had the whole host of wrong views, even undergoing body mortification of the body, ascetic practices, in his search of awakening, not knowing what is the path and what is not the path. So clearly, he did a bodhisattva is not a awakened being. So then related to that, the question arises, so was he destined to become a Sammasambuddha Buddha? If the bodhisattva starts only in his last birth, then what about the whole bodhisattva path? Didn't he perfect the paramis for these incredibly long periods of time in order to become a future Buddha? Well, an interesting discourse in this context is the Arya Pariyesana Sutta from Majjhima Nikaya 26. Right after the Buddha attains Nibbana, straight afterwards, he surveys the world, but he finds little hope in teaching the Dhamma to others. So he's at first not inclined to teach. The sutta says, enough, the Buddha reflects after awakening and says, enough with teaching the Dhamma that even I found hard to reach, for it will be never understood by those who live in lust and hate. Those died in lust, wrapped in darkness, will never discern this abstruse Dhamma, which goes against the worldly stream, subtle, deep, and difficult to see. So he says, very difficult. Nobody will understand this Dhamma. Considering thus, my mind inclined to inaction rather than to teaching the Dhamma. That's what the Buddha thought about doing. Inaction, not teaching. Then the Pali Sutta continues to say, then because the Brahma Sambhati knew with his mind, the thought in my mind, and then he requested eventually the Buddha to start teaching, because there are some people with only little dust in their eyes. So the Buddha's first reflection, I find it very interesting. His first reflection after awakening was how teaching the Dhamma to others will be troublesome for himself, and he inclined not to teach. He decided, I'm not going to teach. However, the Pali commentary doesn't feel very comfortable with that. And it tries very hard to explain these passages away, to say that Brahma Sambhati had to come because Buddhas don't start to teach on their own, so they need an invitation from Mahabrahma. And that's why the Buddha first said, I don't want to teach. And then when Mahabrahma came, then he agreed. And the commentaries say, this is like a law, general law for all Buddhas. When they become awakened, Sambhati shows up on your doorstep and says, please teach. But that is in conflict with the sutta, with the passage I was just reading out. The Buddha says, my mind inclined to inaction. And he was thinking, nobody can understand it. So what the commentary says is the Buddha is lying here. Because when the Buddha says his mind was inclined to inaction, to not teaching the Dhamma, he didn't say, I just want to get Mahabrahma to come up and invite me. He says, I wanted not to teach. So you cannot say, oh no, that's not what the Buddha really meant. He meant something else. The Buddha is not lying. But it's understandable why the commentary tradition has a big problem with that. Because if the Buddha does not teach, or cannot teach, can decide not to teach, this means that there's no bodhisattva path cultivated over a long time where he will then eventually become a Buddha and teach the Dhamma to others. So there's a problem with that. So it's understandable why the commentary is tempted to explain this away. Even though I find personally not so successful, but okay. So now let us look at the same passage in the Chinese parallel that is found in the Agamas. And I will read it out to you. I didn't bring it in the slide, but I will just read it out to you. The same passage from Majjhima Nikaya 26, but this time from the Chinese parallel. Listen carefully. Having just awakened to the supreme, right and complete awakening, I thought, the Buddha thinks, to whom should I first teach the Dhamma? I further thought, should I now first teach the Dhamma to Alara Kalama, which is one of his earlier teachers, who he knew is a very advanced practitioner. At that time, there was a heavenly being up in the sky who told me, "Great sage, may you know that Alara Kalama passed away 7 days ago." Then I also came to know for myself that Alara Kalama had passed away 7 days ago. If he had heard it, he would have quickly understood the Dhamma in accordance with the Dhamma. That's the passage. Do you notice? Do you notice something missing? Something not there? Where is Mahabrahma? Where is Mahabrahma inviting the Buddha to teach? Not coming. Did he forget about it? In the Chinese parallel version, the whole incident of Mahabrahma inviting the Buddha to teach is not there. That's interesting. So this invitation that the commentaries make so much of is not even found in the parallel version. So some say a bodhisattva should aspire to liberate the complete world. But then, there's a sutta in Anguttara Nikaya. The question is this reasonable, or is this likely? Is it possible that a bodhisattva, that you can make a vow, and is it achievable to liberate all beings from their suffering, and only then you also attain parinibbana? Is this possible? Well, in Anguttara Nikaya 10.95, there's a wanderer with the name of Uttiya, and he asks the Buddha if all, or half, or a third of the beings in the world will be liberated by his teachings. And then Ananda replies, saying that Tathagata has no concern whether the entire world will be liberated, or half of the world, or a third of the world. That's interesting, huh? So even the Buddha, he's already awakened. Even this is his last life. He's not thinking, I will liberate the whole world. Those who are here can listen to the Dhamma and practice and benefit from it. But there's no thought about liberating everyone. The Dhamma is pretty much meant for your own purification. In short, neither a bodhisattva path nor a bodhisattva ideal is found in the early discourses or their parallels. We've been looking, people have been studying that deeply. It's not found. No bodhisattva path in the early discourses or their parallels. Nor is there a definite prophecy from a previous Buddha found there, which also many of us have heard that you get a prophecy, a definite confirmation that he becomes the next Buddha. Also not found in the early text. Furthermore, even these 10 parami or 6 parami, how to have them in Mahayana, in the Theravada tradition, we have 10 parami. Even the 10 paramis are not found in the early Buddhist texts. Isn't that interesting? Now the word parami itself is found, of course. It means completeness or perfection, or the highest state. But it never refers to a list of 10 qualities that a person should develop in order to become an Arahant or a future, either a Pacceka Buddha or a Sammasambuddha. I'm sure many of us have heard about this famous list of the 10 paramis: dana, sila, virtue, generosity, renunciation, wisdom, energy, patient endurance, truthfulness, determination, loving-kindness, and equanimity. Now, all these qualities are actually very good and important qualities, and they are mentioned many places in the early texts, but not as a set, and not as something to develop to get liberated or to become a future Buddha. That does not exist. So we have suttas where the Buddha speaks about the benefits of metta, or about virtue, but not as a means to become a future Buddha, nothing like that. So the context how this word Parami comes up into suttas, for example, is in Theragatha 1193. Mahamoggallana says, a member of the Moggallana clan attained to perfection, Parami, attained to perfection and mastery in samadhi and knowledge, wise in the teachings of the unattached, with serene faculties, has burst his bonds like an elephant burst a rope of creeper. So here the word perfection, Parami, is used, but how is it used? He is attained to perfection and mastery in samadhi and knowledge, in concentration and insight. It does not speak about the 10 Parami. So this is a very common down-to-earth usage of the word. So why am I emphasizing this so much? Why is this important? Well, again, not only in the Mahayana schools, even in the Theravada school of Buddhism, many monks, nuns, lay followers, male and females, aspire to become future Buddhas and undertake a bodhisattva vow to practice and stay in samsara, basically, for the sake of becoming a future Buddha and help others attain liberation first. Or some form of this idea. But the bodhisattva path and perfecting the paramis is not found anywhere. All that the Buddha praised is getting enlightened straight away as fast as you can. Like your head is on fire. It's a famous simile. The Buddha says you should not be lazy. You should practice as if your hair were burning and your head is on fire. That's the urgency with which we should practice. Right? If your head is burning, it's not that you will say, well, let me have a rest now. I will make out this fire later. I'll have a nap first. And then I have a good meal. And next week I'm free to make out this fire. No, you make it out straight away. You put this empty cup of water over your head, or a full cup of water maybe, and you make it out. So there's never any suggestion of the Buddha where he would say, it's good to postpone your liberation for later. But this is exactly what happens. This is exactly what happens. Many, many monks, good monks, sincere monks, because the goal is not liberation anymore. The goal is to help others get liberated rather than oneself. So they get engaged in activities that are not geared towards liberation. It can be social welfare, building schools, building hospitals. It's all good things. It's wholesome. But it's not what monks are supposed to do. Monks, actually, we should strive for liberation. And let the Buddhist lay followers do these kinds of wholesome acts. It's good. We need people to do that. But then that's not the path to liberation, and it's also not what the Buddha recommended as the highest goal. It's very important to have the goal inside. What are we practicing for? Liberation. Very simple. And because when people do not have this goal, well, it becomes a distraction. We won't practice. Or maybe you want to go to heaven. Practice then. It's always tomorrow, later. That's a problem. So with comparative study, we can identify, wow, it's amazing. We've checked also many suttas, parallel versions, not found. No bodhisattva path, no paramis to develop to become a future Buddha, no prophecy of the previous Buddha. Amazing. So this is not just small scholarly things that are not so relevant. They're very relevant for many practitioners in Buddhist countries, but also non-Buddhist countries. Okay, I've talked a lot already. Let me draw a small conclusion now. comparative study at first shatters your faith not only in the Abhidhamma or the commentaries, but even in the Bali discourses. It shatters the faith because even the Bali suttas we cannot completely trust. Even those can have undergone some evolution, some corruption, and by putting them side by side, sometimes you find more correct versions in the parallel version. So by doing this kind of study, not on your own, but maybe you have heard from others, it undermines a little bit this almost naive trust in the Bali suttas or the earliest teachings, almost like an MP3 recorder next to the Buddha. That's the Bali suttas. No, even they have undergone some minor often, but some degree of development, usually in the course of oral transmission very early on. So first, the faith is shattered to some degree in the Abhidhamma commentaries and even the Bali suttas. But then it gets partly re-established, or you get a more grown-up version of it. It's not anymore blind belief, but now there's understanding, because from this comparative study, we know how much is actually consistent. And it is truly amazing how over so many centuries, these texts were maintained with such a high level of consistency, just by oral transmission for so many years. That we find differences, yes, but they are very minor often. And as I said earlier, maybe the sequence a bit different, but often it's really small, minor things. Seeing that, my faith became re-established in the Bali Suttas as well. But not anymore this naive belief, yeah, it's exactly the word, there can be nothing wrong, but a more grown-up version we can have, where we understand, oh yeah, this is our earliest complete corpus of texts, but we can still benefit from comparative study and get some nuances corrected. I hope in this talk I could foster some interest among some of you for this, to me, very interesting field of Dhamma studies. And while we don't have enough time for that today, but those of you who are particularly interested in how early Buddhism and comparative studies are related to meditation, and you want to check out sources of not only about this more Dhamma perspective, but also how can we use these early Buddhist texts also as our guide, as our main source for meditation, I have something for you. Now let us look at these slides here. There's 2 books that I can highly recommend in this context. They've been both written by Venerable Anario, a German scholar, monk, and also very sincere practitioner. And both books focus on meditation and mindfulness, but from an early Buddhist perspective. So where different texts are put side by side and the commonalities are found, and the practices that are found within all of them, we would consider to have a good chance to be the authentic teachings of the Buddha. The first one is called Early Buddhist Meditation Studies, and the other one is called Mindfulness in Early Buddhism. Highly recommended if you want to know also about how to put all this knowledge into practice. Venerable Baladhammika, who is a resident monk here in SPS, he once said that the goal of comparative study is not to tear down what we know from the Pali Canon, but to improve our understanding of the Dhamma wherever there is obscurity or uncertainty. So it's not about dismissing anything, but to improve our understanding in areas where we are not so sure. To me personally, this whole field is a bit like undergoing medical treatment or an operation. Before you undergo a big operation or a friend recommends you a medicine, don't you do one thing first? Many of us, what we would do is I would go to ask for a second opinion, especially if it's a big or long treatment or a big operation. We go to ask for a second opinion, or maybe even a third opinion. That's exactly what we are doing with comparative studies. We're asking for a second, third, or fourth opinion by comparing texts and seeing the similarities. And then we put in our trust into those texts that have a high probability of dating back to the historical Buddha himself. So the results of such studies are not meant to be sufficient in their own right, but they can and should influence also one's Dhamma practice, both on the meditation cushion, but also in daily life. So to me, in this way, refuge in the Buddha and his teaching comes to life. The Buddha and his teaching, the Dhamma as he was teaching it, becomes meaningful and fulfilled in our hearts. This is what the refuge in Buddha and Dhamma is all about. So thank you for your attention. And we've been going now for quite a while. I would like to ask Eric, do we still have time for any Q&A?
Yes, Bhante. Okay, Bhante, we have time. Okay. Bhante, thank you, Bhante, for the very excellent sharing today. Very enlightening indeed, the talk today, Bhante.
Thank you very much.
Okay, okay. Here we have some questions posted online for us. So we will put it up. We will put it up on screen for Bhante and everyone to view it. Okay. Okay. If the audience still have any questions, you are welcome to post the questions now. Okay.
Okay. First question. Does this lead us to conclude that early Buddhism equates original Buddhism? Thank you, Bhante. Is early Buddhism the same as original Buddhism? Probably it depends on what you mean with these words. I would say early Buddhism is an attempt to get as close as possible to what the Buddha originally was teaching. But we cannot go back in time like with a time machine. Because even these texts, even if you put these texts side by side, they still come from a period starting maybe 200, 300 years after the Buddha's parinibbana. So we cannot go earlier than that. There's nobody alive, as far as I know, from that period. If you know, please send him over to me. I'm very interested to talk to him. But here on earth, we have nobody alive who is still alive from that time. So we rely on these early texts. So this is what we mean with early Buddhist studies, early Buddhism. Yeah. There's another question. So here, can we also say that there are inconsistencies in Abhidhamma Pitaka scriptures? Well, if you have been listening, probably this is what one can say. There are inconsistencies even in the suttas. But as I said earlier, by comparative study, putting the Abhidhammas of different schools side by side, they are so different from each other that it seems almost no common core. Whereas the suttas and the Vinaya have very little differences, and they're very similar to each other. But the Abhidhammas of different schools are very different. So applying the principle of what is common has a good chance to be early. If we apply that principle, then the logical conclusion would be, this is what most scholars anyway say since many years, that the Abhidhamma is a historically speaking later development, which is attempting to explain the Dhamma in systematic ways and going to ultimate realities, leaving conventions behind. But this is an attempt that has grown and developed gradually and was not found in the very earliest strata of teachings. That's why we didn't have a Abhidhamma Pitaka at the very beginning. Next question. In your view, how many percent error in the transmission of original teaching to the current scripture now? How high is the percentage? So let us speak only in this context. I have already now explained about the Abhidhamma. Let's speak about the comparison between the Pali version and the Chinese version of the Majjhima Nikaya, for example. There's a very good book, a comparative study of the Majjhima Nikaya, also published by the same scholar, Venerable Analayo, where he has highlighted and marked down all these differences. And this is very comfortable because I personally, I can't read Chinese, not to speak of classical Chinese. Yet it has been translated into English, and he's done all this difficult work of comparing. So I can read, and we can read now, the differences among these versions. And my general impression is that the differences are very few, far in between. So generally speaking, I would say the Pali Suttas, as well as the Agamas, are very reliable. But there are some relevant differences. And even when it comes to practice, for example, in the Satipatthana Sutta, if you put all the versions of the Satipatthana Sutta side by side, not just Pali and one, or not just the Chinese, but also all the versions we have, because Satipatthana Sutta is a very popular discourse, so it was spread very widely, and we have quite a number of parallels. I think 5 or 6 identified parallels. And if you look at which practices are they having in common, interestingly, just to give you one example, in the Dhammanupassana section, contemplation of Dhammas, among all the different practices we have in the Pali version, there's only 2 practices that all versions share in common. Which are they? Number 1, the practice of identifying the 5 hindrances and knowing also the causes and conditions, how they are come to be and how to overcome them. And the second practice is about the 7 awakening factors. Again, how to make them arouse, what are their conditions, and so on. These are the 2 practices, the only 2 that are found in all parallels. So that I find interesting because, well, there's so many teachings and so many practices already. Sometimes you have to make a choice anyway. You cannot practice everything every day. So for me then, why don't I choose a practice that is found everywhere in all the Buddhist schools, that has a high probability of being an early teaching of the Buddha? And then these other practices I can also do from time to time. There's nothing bad about them, but I would put my emphasis on those practices that I have trust, that they date back to the Buddha himself. So in this way, there are differences, but they are often a bit more subtle, and for those who are really interested deeply in the Dhamma, can be very interesting. If you don't have so much time for this kind of study, don't worry. That's what I meant earlier. Having done all this comparative study, I came away now with the feeling, even if you just take the discourses, the Pali Suttas on their own, and just practice accordingly, you can get all the way to liberation. They are consistent enough, they are sufficient for our practice. But if you have this interest, like I have a little bit, I really want to know what the Buddha himself was teaching, and I want to find out the earliest, a little bit like the Sherlock Holmes, private detective, then this could be something interesting for you also. And often you can so for practice, I think it's maybe not always so important, but for general Dhamma understanding, the examples I've given earlier, I think they are very important. Think about the Bodhisattva path, Bodhisattva ideal, about the gradual disappearing of the asasana, about dismantling these beliefs. I think that is very important. Maybe last question here. Do you believe about the existence of Arhat in this modern world, according to your knowledge? Yes, I very clearly believe and am of the impression and understanding that even in our current time and age, the path can be practiced all the way to final liberation. And I'm also very much of the opinion of even having encountered and met some individuals like that. And in the end, who they are is not even so important. For you individually, the important thing is to understand, yes, it can be done, and then to do it. Just like the Nike advertisement, just do it. But yes, I'm very confident that all the Aryan stages can still be attained and are open for practice. Like the Buddha said, the doors to the deathless are open. But don't waste your time, they are closing. The time is getting further and further. We're getting further and further away from the Buddha himself. So the doors to the deathless are closing. Okay? So I leave you with that. Practice for liberation, and I wish you all the best along the way.
Thank you, Bhante, for the very excellent answer. And also we thank the audience for their equally good questions. Okay, but if, dear Dharma friends, if you have any more questions, since we are running short of time, please post your question directly to Bhante Facebook page. Thank you.
I don't have a Facebook page. But you can post it to your Facebook page or SBS Facebook page, and somebody will forward it then to me, and I will provide an answer in an indirect manner.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
So before we conclude, we would like to invite Ayasma Arya Dhammika to share the merits accrued today with all the Devas and our departed loved ones.
Okay. We can. Can we see the slides again? Okay. So we have accumulated a lot of merits, not only now by listening to the Dhamma, but also before and throughout the day. And now is the time to invite our departed relatives and friends to rejoice and participate in the subsequent sharing of merits. So we can invite them together by reciting the following verses, line by line. I will recite one line, and you just repeat at home on your own. And in this way, we go through it together. We can raise our hands in Anjali. Please repeat after me. Idang me nyatinang hotu. Sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang no nyatinang hotu. Sukita hontu nyatayo. Idam vo nyatinang hotu. Sukita hontu nyatayo. Ettavata cha amhehi. Sampadang punya sampadang. Sabbe satta anumodantu. Sabba sampatti siddhya. And let us also make an aspiration towards Nibbana, so that the good karma we have accumulated will also support us on the path to liberation. Please repeat after me. Idang me punyang asavakkaya vahang hotu. Idang me punyang nibbanassa paccayo hotu. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Now we have come to the end of our Dhamma sharing. On behalf of Buddhist Mahavihara, we would like to take this opportunity to extend our highest thanks to Ayasma Arya Dhammika for
You're welcome. It was a
Yes,
pleasure.
very excellent sharing. And also to our generous sponsor and to all our dedicated audiences. May all be well, peaceful and happy. Sadhu, sadhu.